In 2004, in a mid-sized American city that rarely attracted national attention, a man named Daniel Carter walked into a police station, believing that cooperation was not only harmless, but responsible. Daniel was 34 years old, held a stable job in operations management, had no criminal history, and had lived his entire adult life under the assumption that the legal system existed to distinguish clearly between people who did wrong and people who did not. He believed the law was logical, fair, and fundamentally aligned with common sense. Like many people, he believed that honesty functioned as a shield rather than a liability, and that truth naturally protected those who had nothing to hide. Daniel had worked several years earlier at a logistics and distribution company that handled regional freight contracts across multiple states. His role had been administrative and procedural. He was not an executive, not a shareholder, and not someone with authority over financial strategy or corporate policy. His daily responsibilities involved monitoring workflows, coordinating between departments, and ensuring that shipments moved on schedule. At no point during his employment did Daniel believe he was participating in anything improper, let alone illegal. When he left the company, it was on good terms, and he never imagined his name would resurface years later in a criminal investigation. The investigation itself began quietly, triggered by an internal audit conducted after a change in company ownership. The new management ordered a comprehensive review of historical records, seeking to identify inefficiencies and financial leakage. During this process, auditors discovered inconsistencies that could not be easily explained. Certain vendor payments did not align with shipment records. Adjustments appeared in the system outside of documented approval workflows. While none of this conclusively proved criminal behavior, it raised enough concern to warrant further scrutiny. When auditors are unable to reconcile discrepancies internally, standard procedure often requires escalation. In this case, the matter was referred to law enforcement, not because a crime was proven, but because the potential for misconduct existed. Detectives assigned to the case approached it methodically. They did not begin with accusations. Instead, they reconstructed the company's internal structure from archived materials, mapping access levels, responsibilities, and historical changes in procedure. This process took months. Daniel's name emerged during this reconstruction because of his prior system access. He had held credentials that allowed certain adjustments, and his tenure coincided with the period under review. From an investigative standpoint, that alone justified contacting him. Importantly, at this stage, Daniel was not a suspect. He was a data point. When the detective contacted Daniel by phone, the language used was intentional. Daniel was told he was not under arrest and that his assistance would be voluntary. The detective emphasized that they were simply trying to understand how things were done at the time, particularly since many records were incomplete or outdated. Daniel was reassured that this was routine and that former employees were often the best source of institutional knowledge. The conversation was polite, professional, and entirely non-confrontational. Daniel did not consult a lawyer. He did not consider it necessary. He believed that lawyers were for people in trouble, and he did not believe he was in trouble. Declining to cooperate felt wrong to him, almost unethical. He believed that refusing to speak might make him look guilty, and he wanted to avoid any appearance of secrecy. He agreed to meet with detectives voluntarily. On the day of the interview, Daniel arrived at the police station without anxiety. He parked his car, walked through the front entrance, and checked in at the desk like any other visitor. He was escorted to a small interview room and told again that he was free to leave at any time. There was no physical restraint, no raised voices, and no sense of urgency. Everything about the setting conveyed safety and normalcy. The interview began with basic questions about Daniel's background, where he had worked, how long he had been employed, and what his role entailed. Daniel answered openly, explaining his duties in detail. He described how the company functioned operationally, the pressures associated with meeting delivery deadlines, and the informal practices that had developed over time to compensate for outdated systems. His tone was calm and cooperative. He felt he was helping. As the interview continued, detectives asked increasingly specific questions about internal controls. They inquired about access permissions, oversight mechanisms, and whether written policies always matched real-world practice. Daniel explained that procedures were often flexible. Adjustments were sometimes made after hours to prevent operational delays. He stressed that these practices were common knowledge within the company and not hidden or secretive. At no point did detectives interrupt or challenge his statements. Instead, they listened attentively, occasionally asking him to clarify or restate points. This technique encouraged Daniel to expand on his answers. He felt comfortable, even confident. He believed that transparency was working in his favor. Eventually, one detective asked whether Daniel had ever personally made adjustments outside formal procedures. Daniel hesitated briefly. He considered the implications, but ultimately chose honesty. He acknowledged that on rare occasions, he had made minor adjustments to keep operations running smoothly. He emphasized that these actions were routine, authorized informally, and never done for personal gain. From a legal standpoint, this admission altered the trajectory of the interview entirely. Under criminal law, especially in cases involving financial records, even minor deviations can carry significant weight. Intent does not always need to be proven directly. Knowledge and participation can be inferred. By acknowledging involvement, Daniel placed himself within the legal framework of the alleged misconduct. The detectives continued the interview, asking Daniel to confirm timelines and restate previous answers. They summarized his statements and asked him to verify their accuracy. Daniel agreed, believing precision would protect him. Each confirmation strengthened the evidentiary record. Each word became fixed. When the interview ended, Daniel was thanked and told he might be contacted again. He left believing the matter was resolved. He returned to his routine, unaware that the interview would later be reviewed, not as a conversation, but as evidence. Months later, Daniel received formal notice that he was being charged. The charges alleged participation in unauthorized record adjustments and conspiracy related to financial reporting. Daniel was shocked. He could not reconcile the accusations with his memory of events. He had not stolen money. He had not concealed information. He had simply answered questions. Only then did Daniel retain a criminal defense attorney. The attorney's first concern was Daniel's interview. Voluntary statements given without counsel are among the most powerful tools available to prosecutors. Suppressing such statements requires demonstrating coercion, deception, or a violation of rights. None of those elements were present. The interview had been lawful. The defense strategy shifted from denial to mitigation. The attorney explained that the case would likely focus on Daniel's own words rather than documentary evidence. The goal became limiting the interpretation of those words and separating Daniel's conduct from any broader criminal scheme. This required expert testimony, contextual analysis, and careful framing. At trial, prosecutors relied heavily on audio recordings. They played excerpts repeatedly, emphasizing certain phrases and pauses. They argued that Daniel's statements demonstrated awareness of irregular practices and voluntary participation. They did not need to prove malicious intent. Under the law, participation alone could satisfy the elements of the offense. The defense argued that Daniel's statements were misinterpreted, that workplace practices were informal, and that no criminal intent existed. They highlighted Daniel's clean record and lack of personal gain. But juries tend to trust recorded statements. Words spoken calmly and confidently carry authority, even when context is disputed. The jury returned a partial conviction. Daniel avoided incarceration, but the conviction carried lasting consequences. His professional credentials were revoked, employment opportunities disappeared, financial instability followed, relationships suffered. His identity became defined by a felony that originated not from a criminal act, but from a conversation. Daniel's case illustrates a fundamental truth of criminal law. The right to remain silent is not designed to protect the guilty. It exists to protect individuals from unintentionally providing evidence against themselves. Police officers are legally permitted to ask questions without providing warnings in many situations. They are trained to do so strategically. The responsibility to invoke constitutional rights lies entirely with the individual. Criminal cases are not decided by fairness or moral intuition. They are decided by admissible evidence, interpretation, and legal standards. Words once spoken cannot be reclaimed. In court, they often matter more than intentions or beliefs about justice. Daniel learned this too late. His story is not about violence or malice. It is about misunderstanding the system, and it is repeated every day in courtrooms across the United States.